I'm really happy to be talking with you about warning signs and indicators because I think this is the bedrock on which we base our practice with these children. I think it's really important that we know how to recognise the warning signs and indicators, and we learn and take every opportunity to learn as many of these as we can. And again, these things are going to change over time, so what we know now is going to be different in 10 years' time. So it's important for us to know the warning signs and indicators because one of our tasks in recognising and responding to abuse is forming a reasonable suspicion. And reasonable suspicion goes in these, talk marks. Reasonable suspicion. It's a technical legal term that's used to describe the state of mind that we need to have to make a child protection notification. Okay? It's not a gut feeling. We can't just report on some kind of gut feeling, although our gut often does come into play. But we have to have something that's more concrete, a reasonable suspicion. And one of the ways the ways in which we can develop a reasonable suspicion are from our first-hand observations of what's happening to a child, although it's more likely that family, friends, relatives, the children themselves and parents are going to make those first-hand observations than us at school. Okay, particularly those in upper primary and secondary. It's very hard for you guys. In early childhood, it's easier because we get to see the parents on a daily basis pretty much at school. So first-hand observations of treatment of a child is one of the things that can help us form a reasonable suspicion. The child's condition, how the child is at school every day, that can help us to form a reasonable suspicion. What the child says to us can help us form a reasonable suspicion. And then how that compares with what the parent or caregiver says as well. So when an actual disclosure is made from a parent, that's cause for immediate action. Or if a parent gives an account of injuries that you can see clearly but their explanation is very questionable. Prior reports can also help us form a reasonable suspicion. And this is not because we want to demonise parents who've been in the child protection system, but being in the child protection system is a risk factor. Okay? And if a parent has abused one child, we need to be looking out for the other children. If there has been a report on a child that we are looking after at a particular point in time, we need to pay special attention to that child and prick up our ears in relation to observing that child and noticing what's going on for them. So when we are forming a reasonable suspicion and when we're noticing things with children, we should observe and make written notes as soon as we develop those inklings, as soon as we develop that reasonable suspicion. And we must be as factual as possible when we make those notes. I often say to the students, there are a few of my students here today, that the way that we can do that is by imagining or writing what would a video camera on the wall capture. So it's going to be quite clinical, it's going to be removed of all our own emotions in relation to recognising abuse. What would a video camera on the wall capture about how this child is in my classroom, or what that child has said? These are some headlines out of newspapers. Around about 25 children each year in Australia die at the hands of their parents. And perhaps some of their carers, maybe even their teachers, if they had have known some of the warning signs, maybe could have prevented some of those, or worked with others to prevent some of those. At the top, I've got a little definition of a little descriptor of what I'm talking about when I mean physical abuse. So when we're talking about physical abuse today, we're talking about hitting a child, shaking them, throwing, kicking, beating them, choking them, restraining them, burning them, cutting, biting them, or choking them. All of those kinds of things. Physical abuse is not usually identified on the basis of one incident that you see, although sometimes there is one incident that's just so severe that it prompts action. But it's not usually identified on the basis of one single event. It's usually a combination of factors together over time. So it might be that you see bruises, lacerations, object-shaped marks, bite marks or fractures, burns and scalds. We're not expecting that teachers or people who work in schools become medical practitioners. That's not our role. But there are some basic things about how injuries look in children and where they're positioned on children's bodies that can let us know whether we should be pricking up our ears or proceeding as usual. So, non-accidental injuries or injuries that are deliberately caused to children are usually on parts of the bodies where they can't have been caused accidentally. So they're not on the bony parts of the bodies. You know, if you work in primary school or in early childhood, you'll know kids in primary school, you experienced it yourself, your own children even, they've got bruises up their arms and on their knees and on their shins. That's a part of a fact of life of childhood, on the bony parts of their bodies, but not normally on the soft parts of the bodies, on the buttocks, on the torso, on the face, you know, on the soft parts of the face, on the lips, on the mouth, the backs of the thighs and so on. So these are the places where non-accidental injuries are more likely to happen. With physical abuse, it's most likely that it's repeated over time, that it's repeated accidents or incidents. They can be vaguely or bizarrely described by the child or by the parent in explanation. For example, bite marks that might appear on a child's body. So you might see bite marks that are of varying ages. They're clearly an adult-sized bite mark, so they're not something where a sibling has, you know, lost their temper and bitten another child. They might be different aged bites on a child's body over time. And the explanation given to that, for that, this is one that might be heard in early childhood mostly, but that a child is going through a biting phase and therefore the parent is biting the child to teach the child that biting hurts and they shouldn't do it. Okay, so that's an explanation. That's quite a common explanation when parents bite their children and leave marks. So you might also see hand marks on a child. Years ago we used to see cigarette burns. We don't see so many of those nowadays, but they can still happen. They're usually on hands or the soles of feet. Lash marks on a child, or a black eye. The next slide shows, kind of points out some of these. This is from a textbook from a textbook, but you can see in the top left-hand corner there a hand mark on a child's face that can be quite distinctive when you see it. The middle picture at the top is a child who's been restrained, marks left on a child's face because they've been restrained because they're crying too much. It doesn't only happen to babies, it can happen to older children as well. Restraint marks on a child's ankle where they've been held to be in a chair while they've been made to eat their dinner, or restrained and held in their bed so they won't climb out of bed during the night. Cigarette burns down the bottom there of different ages and stages of healing. And this diagram in the bottom right just points out a little bit more about what I said there about the position of accidental and non-accidental injuries. So accidental injuries, just to recap, are those that are likely on the bony parts of a child's body, so where they're going to fall over or fall off their bike or fall off the fence and hit the bony parts. Abuse-related injuries are those usually that occur on the soft parts of the body. So, and for us as teachers that's tricky because they can often be covered by clothing. Okay, so just going back then, the explanation for these physical injuries in children can often vary between the child and the parent, between the child and their sibling, between, you know, the two parents, or vary by an individual over time. So it can be quite bizarre, but they can make sense. So it might be that a child says that they fell off their bicycle when it's clear that the injuries that they have on their body aren't really consistent with those of falling off a bicycle. So this might also be coupled then with the child wearing, as the children get older, they get aware that they've got to cover this up. So they wear excessive layers of clothing to hide their injuries, and they might be reluctant to remove that clothing for normal physical activities, or, you know, they might be wearing the jumper when it's a really hot day, you know, those kind of things. And again, those kind of things are coupled with behavioural indicators. So things like the child being wary of adults, of wincing when, the teacher does a wild gesticulation and the child is suddenly under the table because they're thinking that the hand is coming in their direction. So being wary of adults, being apprehensive with crying. So children who grow up in families where there is physical abuse often become highly attuned. When one of their siblings is crying, that's going to mean trouble. That means you need to do something. That means you need to get yourself to safety or do something, immediately. So they'll be attuned to crying in other children. And they'll have some response to that, that's different from other kids. They might be frightened of their parents. They might describe their fear of their parents to you. They might be afraid to go home, or they might actually report that their parent has hurt them in some way. They might tell you or disclose their physical abuse to you. So when we're thinking about physical abuse, we need to think about the developmental age of the child. So things like, for example, in early childhood, when children fall over, particularly when they're, say under 3, they fall over on the heaviest part of their body, which is their head. So young children often have bony head injuries. As children get older, they learn to break their fall by with their arms and, their knees. So as a child develops over time, the kinds of accidental injuries they have will vary over time as well. It just makes sense from what we know about children. So we need to think about the shape of the injury. Is it a regular shape? Does it look like it could have been caused by an object? A kettle cord, a hairbrush, a wooden spoon. These things that are commonly available in households, a fly swatter. The place of the injury, the degree of force necessary to cause an injury. So it does actually require quite a great deal of adult force to result in a bruise on a child. And the number of old and new injuries. So, there's these little things, in addition to knowing about warning signs, these additional things about injuries that we could become aware of that would just help us to know whether this situation is something we need to be concerned about or something that's business as usual. Okay, and if we wanted to get really, if we're in a school where we see a lot of physical abuse, for example, we might want to learn a little bit about bruises and their ages. So what do early bruises look like? They're red or purple, whereas over time they look a bit different. So we might even be able to get a handle on, what happens over a weekend, or if a child's been away for a week and comes back with yellow bruises all over them. It's a good explanation. There might be a good explanation in there for why they were away for that week.